Okay, welcome everyone to one of three concurrent sessions. I'm very happy with, or I'm really delighted with our speaker today. I want to introduce myself first, though. I'm David Kimberly. I'm a biology professor at Westminster College, but also on the board of UC, and I will be hosting today. Aaron DeKaiser is also co-hosting today, so if you have any questions or concerns as we're moving through today's session, you can feel free to message myself or Aaron, and we can get to the bottom of whatever issue you're having. So I'd like to maybe give a few words about our speaker today. You probably have already seen his materials in the bio, but I'd like to go ahead and reiterate those materials. Robert Wilson is our speaker today, and he's in his 19th year of teaching science at Rowland Hall, which is really impressive. There he mostly teaches ecology and climate science. He applies his experience as a field biologist and ornithologist to develop outdoor education to learn about our regional environment. So incredibly appropriate fields of study for sure. So with that, I'm delighted to turn this over to Rob. Take it away.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming. It's an honor to be here. Really excited to share with you my use of Aldo Leopold and citizen science that I've been working on for several years now. I'd like to start out with my Leopold story. So how I've encountered Leopold and his work throughout my life. And it actually goes back quite a long time now. When I was in junior high, my dad gave me a subscription to this magazine, Wyoming Wildlife. And at the time, the editor always featured a quote from Leopold on the cover, and it was, "Conservation is a state of harmony between man and nature," which is from Sand County Almanac. And that editor had, you know how magazine editors have their introductory column to each issue, and his was called The Land Ethic. And so there I was, 12 or 13 years old. I wanted to read about pheasants and ducks and stuff, but every month I'd read this essay, The Land Ethic. And boy, did that stick. Not long afterwards in college, it seemed like an eternity then, but you guys know how the years pile up. My freshman year, I took a class in ecology and the general biology sequence, and Dr. McKenzie assigned us to read a Sand County Almanac. And I thought, well, I recognize that name. And so I have, as an artifact today, that original copy from Dr. McKenzie's ecology class in spring of 1991. And I'd moved to Oregon, and the world was bright and fresh, and I pored over that book. And as Leopold would do, he liked looking at the history of objects. Things would float down the stream at his farm, and he'd pull in old timber and stuff and wonder where it came from upstream. So I don't know if the light will show very well. This 30-year-old copy is all yellow. I'm surprised it's even still functional. It's taped together in the spine. And here's a bright, shiny copy. I started teaching Leopold in my science classes at Rowland Hall, 5 or 6 years ago. Actually longer, but more methodically in the past 5 or 6 years. And last spring, when we went to distance learning, I used it extensively. I started assigning many more essays than I had before. Usually I would just assign the essay for the month. And I assigned more of them. They're all fairly short and fairly accessible, though as a classic, you discover there's more going on than originally you discover your first reading. And in distance learning, and for the teachers in this room, you might really be able to relate. You have the class that gathers like we are today on a screen. And after a few days of that, I really got the sense that there they were at home, huddled around their screen, not even huddled, just isolated around their screen. And it's a really sedentary behavior and really isolating behavior. And so I started assigning most of my homework out of the almanac. And I would say, today, spend a couple hours outside and listen for birds. Today, go find the first bloom of something. Today, go find a creek in your neighborhood and figure out where it ends up and where it came from. And that was twofold, much like Leopold's writing was twofold. One was, it's a great way to study nature and science and, observe phenomena and explain them, which is the basic action of science. And then it was good for them to get outside and you get out of their bedrooms and the isolated and sedentary habits of distance learning. And so we had a similar challenge this spring or this fall coming back to school for the past, as long as I've taught at Rowland Hall, like David said, 19 years now. We had a week away for the ninth graders where we'd go to the desert and more recently to the Uinta Mountains. And I really worked in natural history and Leopold to that experience. And we didn't do that this year. We didn't want to take the bus ride and stay in cabins in the age of COVID. So I planned a Beyond the Classroom day at a park near my house. It's in the 15th and 15th neighborhood. Some of you might know Wasatch Hollow Park. And not long ago, the city decided to make it a nature area. It could have been developed, parts of it, and they made it into a nature area that it's only about 10 acres. It's surrounded by subdivisions. And now it's a nature area. In the spring, I discovered a herd of deer in there, a doe and a fawn and a buck I was able to see. I've heard there are foxes in there, wonderful birds. So I took the entire ninth grade, about 70 students up there for a day. And we did a rotation of activities where we'd read a Leopold essay and then do a citizen science project where they would take the discoveries from the essay and then make similar discoveries on their own. And they were able to submit those to these citizen science platforms that I'll share with you today. Some of you might be familiar with the work of Leopold, but I'm not going to assume that. So I'll give you a little biography of Aldo Leopold. He actually goes back quite a bit. His ideas seem so fresh and modern to me. And a lot of times, when you read the work of people from earlier generations, you have to, as Alex said today, sometimes it's cringeworthy. I never find anything like that in Leopold. He was born in 1887, died in 1948. He's born in Iowa, and he was one of the first students at the Yale School of Forestry that was started by Gifford Pinchot. So he was one of the first students of Gifford Pinchot. Fascinating history between their two careers. And he went as a forester to Arizona. And imagine how wild Arizona would have been 100 years ago. There were still wolves in Arizona. There were still grizzly bears in Arizona. And that's where he formulated a lot of his ideas about the land and as an agent of the Forest Service, how it ought to be cared for. He didn't start to work on the almanac until much later in life, though some of the essays he did write and publish earlier. A lot of people might think that the almanac is just a culmination of the essays he worked over his life, and I thought that for a long time because it wasn't published until after he died. And he died at a young age. I think he was 61. So I thought it was a posthumous collection. But the story is much more interesting. He had been working on this. He bought a farm outside of Madison where he was on the faculty. He started the Department of Game Management, is considered the founding father of that as a science. And he bought a farm, an abandoned farm in the sand counties of south central Wisconsin. And he did it as a weekend getaway for his family and a place he could go observe natural history and hunting and fishing and camping that his family did together. But it is also a very intentional experiment in restoration ecology. The farm had been owned by a bootlegger who vanished in, as he put it, the dusts of the Great Depression in the Dust Bowl, and it had back taxes on it. So he probably got it at a good price, 120 acres. And for the almost 20 years that he went to that farm almost every weekend, he restored it. He planted pines and other trees. He restored the meadows, nurtured the wildlife there. And in doing so, had a really intimate and close observation of the land and its creatures in southern Wisconsin. And this is where the beauty of the almanac, I think, really originates, because not all the essays are about the farm, but many are. He's applying for us the literary device of synecdoche, and you can focus on the farm in the comings and goings of skunks and bluebirds and grouse and the change of the leaves. But after a while, you realize I wouldn't be that interested in this if it were just about somebody else's farm. He's using that one thing to represent wherever you might live, or wherever you might have been or you might go. So it could be our own valley here, our own mountains. It could be a beach. It could be the ocean. It's any ecosystem that you have a chance to encounter or think about. And then it's also the ecosystem of the earth. But you can't write compellingly about something that big. You're going to lose your audience. So it's about the farm. It's a very accessible book, easy to find, and fairly easy reading. This is not James Joyce. And if you discover that you are interested in scholarship of the almanac, then I really recommend the companion. And I've been researching that quite a bit to compose my lessons and also this presentation for you today. The almanac is an invitation to perception that begins on his farm, expands to other places and times, and concludes with an articulation of the land ethic. It was very intentionally composed after long negotiation with Knopf, publisher, but Knopf turned it down. They didn't like the philosophical parts where he breaks away from descriptive natural history to a real examination of people's relationship with the living world. But he had submitted manuscript to Oxford University Press, and in April of 1948, he got a phone call from Oxford, and they'd accepted the manuscript. They were excited to publish it. That was on a Wednesday, and that was the time of year when they did a lot of planting for the pine forest he was growing on his farm. So that Friday, he loaded his family, as he often would have, and went to the farm. And that Saturday morning, the story is that he was in especially high spirits with the past flowers coming out and birds arriving, migration. And Saturday morning, a fire started on a neighbor's farm. And they were always afraid of fires because they'd planted this grove of pines that that could burn. And central Wisconsin had a long history of fires because the peat bogs that had been drained created great fuel, almost like a pile of burning coal or a pile of burning tires. This peat would burn. And so they went to help the neighbor fight the fire. He ran off to get a bucket and didn't show up. And sometime later, they found his body in a meadow where the flames had lightly burned over it. It was later determined that he died of a heart attack. So he died with the satisfaction that his book had been accepted for publication, but he never got to go through the galley proofs and the satisfaction of seeing it sold and seeing how well received it was by the world's public. I'll quote from the foreword. It's the very first line in the book that he composed. There are some who can live without wild things and some who cannot. These essays are the delights and dilemmas of one who cannot. And so from there, this is a part literary conference or literary meeting we're having right now. And we can't very well do that without sharing some text. And so I'm going to paste in a link to one of the better known essays called Thinking Like a Mountain. I'd like you to take a few minutes to read this. It's only 2 pages, and do a breakout room for 10 minutes. And I'll paste in the discussion guide. And I also have a question that I'll I'll pose to us when we come back together. Please let me know if you have any trouble opening that.
I have no idea how to open that. I have no idea.
Is it working for anybody else?
Yeah, so the link is working just fine for me.
Can you copy and paste that link into your
Web browser.
address bar?
I don't even know where the link is.
So if you look at the kind of the toolbar in the Zoom video pane, there's a little bubble that says chat. And if you click on the chat, it should bring up the, on the side, the link.
Oh, right here. Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Thanks.
Robert, would you like to go ahead and assign breakout rooms, or would you like me to do that? How would you like to proceed? You're muted.
Would you assign breakout rooms, please?
Yes, of course. I'll do maybe 3 to 4 participants per room. Is that okay? So that'd be 3 rooms.
That sounds just right.
Okay. Okay, so everyone that is in this session should now have been invited to a breakout room. And so if you wouldn't mind accepting that invite, then you will move into a breakout session where once you've read the text, you can then freely discuss.
Dave, do you know if we have instructions?
I don't know more than what he mentioned kind of in his intro. It seems to me that maybe we have a discussion as to how what this means to us.
There is the study guide. Did anybody look at that?
Oh, I didn't. Let's take a look at that.
I have the link because I have it open if anyone doesn't have it.
That would be great for me.
Aaron, Dave popped that down in the chat if you see that.
Thank you.
Well, I'm super familiar with the green fire. This excerpt, I am embarrassed to admit I had no idea it was from San County Almanac.
Yeah, and I've read San County Almanac twice, but it's now been maybe a decade since I've done that. So this is all really bringing up a lot of memories for when I read it in school and things like that. So, but reading it with kind of new context for current state of things, but then also just professionally in new context, it's really interesting.
One of the discussion questions towards the end, which is the closing exercise, so maybe I'm jumping the gun here, but it actually asks, have you ever had a green fire moment? How did it change you? And if you hadn't had one, how would you know one was coming? Interesting question.
I mean, I definitely have. I'm mainly maybe before I get to thinking more about the green fire, something that I found interesting was his thought that fewer wolves would mean more deer, which would then be a hunter's paradise. But then the sentence right after is the wolf in the mountain would disagree, and I think there's it seems like there's a maturity of understanding that just comes in those like 2 or 3 sentences where certainly it makes sense that fewer predators would then mean more prey. And so then my activity, which might be hunting, I could do it more. But that's short-sighted and nearsighted, whereas then the mountain and the wolf have more of a long-sighted approach. And it seems to make sense now as well that if we get rid of all the wolves, sure, there's more deer to be hunted, but like he then mentions later in the text that it's as if God were given shears, right, and only to cut it down. So I think it's really interesting is that it shows this progression and maturity about just systems in general and how one little component, when it's removed, it might seem minor. It's completely interconnected, and almost every little thing is crucial.
But the first thing that came to my mind when I was reading this was Serengeti rules and keystone species. I'm sure you guys all know about that. And balance. And, Serengeti rules is balance within nature and, species. No humans involved. And of course, this one involves humans too. So, I think it's really fascinating how you could tie those two together, the whole Serengeti rules and this, Aldo Leopold and Keystone, and just balance with humans too. That movie Serengeti Rules had a big impact on me. Keystone species. I'm not a scientist. I'm an environmental educator, but it really opened my eyes a lot. So it ties in really well with this.
For me, only knowing kind of this excerpt as Leopold's seeing the green fire, I think what it reminds me of is when I work in riparian restoration in the conservation coral world. And, so a lot of what we do is cutting down trees. They're Russian olive and tamarisk, and we get so focused on the work side of it and the actual removal of the trees. But I was at one of the work sites with a fish biologist, and he caught and pulled up a flannelmouth sucker, which is not a fish I've ever seen. It's an endangered and threatened fish, so it might not be a fish that anyone here has seen, but it's a wild looking fish with kind of human lips. It's a really amazing fish. And kind of looking at that fish in his hands, for me, it really drove home the work we were doing. Just thinking about the fact that this work that's really hard and painful at times, because the Russian olive is the tree that bites back. Just seeing that it possibly is making a difference on this one fish was a really powerful moment for me. And anytime I'm feeling kind of daunted, I think back to that fish often. I have a picture of it and I look at it too. So a little different, but I think that was my green fire moment, or at least one of them. And if you ever get a chance to see a flannelmouth sucker, take it. They're pretty cool.
What is it? A flannel mouth?
Yeah, flannelmouth sucker. It's an threatened and endangered fish in Utah. This was on the Escalante River. So, but yeah, just looking at this fish, I mean, I wouldn't have put it as a green fire, but I felt this. I think I felt what he saw, but in reverse. Rather than watching the green fire die, I just saw the green fire in this fish. Again, I wouldn't describe it that way. Probably not, never as eloquently as he did, but it was just a powerful moment.
Yeah, and I think that the green fire, although it has a lot of alliteration, that's kind of what he's getting at. It's a powerful moment, and I think for him, seeing the green fire leave, like, it put into juxtaposition what his desire was, which was to kill the wolf. But then seeing the green fire leave, I think all of a sudden he was like, well, is this what I should be doing? It kind of it was a seminal moment, which I think exactly what a green fire moment is supposed to be in this case. I think it's a great example.
I just have a personal question. Do any of you guys hunt?
I don't.
No. Do you know?
I'm from a hunting family.
Really? And do you know people who do hunt? And if so, how do you talk to them about it? I personally, there's no way I could even imagine. I could never go there. But how do you talk to people who hunt?
Well, I actually enjoy the meat they sometimes give me. So I really like elk sausage. And so, and I come from a hunting family. So it's probably incredibly hypocritical of me that while I could never pull the trigger, I do like a good elk sausage.
Right.
I guess I can relate to them because it's hormone and antibiotic free meat. It's, in a world with reduced predators, that hunting does play a role in conservation. There's some, it also funds a lot of conservation work. Right.
Yeah, I can totally see that in areas where there's too many and you need to thin it out, which is in our country in some parts for sure.
And I have at least one really close friend who gets an elk tag most like every other year or so, but then he also goes deer hunting, bow and rifle, actually a few times a season. And we've had a number of friendly debates as to I'm never on the side that like hunting should be outlawed and no one should ever hunt. I think the debate is always on the weight that we put into hunting for management. And so like I come from like a pretty idealistic preservation type of mindset where like I would rather preserve an area rather than conserve it for multiple uses. And that's not for everything, but that just tends to be where I start. And so it was particularly interesting because there was an amendment, right, to our Utah Constitution this time around to include hunting as like into our Constitution, which is really interesting. And so that led us into kind of a debate where I was essentially saying that I would prefer that management not think of hunting first. Whenever we think of like managing deer populations, a lot of people are like, well, we'll just increase the number of tags that we can give out. And I think that's fine. But I think this text in particular signals to the fact that, well, the predators, they should have a role, right? And he even goes on to say that he saw that states got rid of wolf population after wolf population, saw their elk and deer populations boom, and then what did that do to everything? And honestly, I don't think that there's enough hunters and enough tags that we could give out to depress most of our ungulate populations. So it's complicated, and as you're saying, it's complicated. But it is interesting to have these debates with people who do hunt, because they enjoy it for the practice, for the sport, for the meat.
Tradition,
exactly.
Bonding.
Yeah, like there are real
Yeah,
benefits. Yeah.
Well, and it's the same
I
thing with,
definitely have.
I mean, it's the
Go
same
ahead.
thing with fishing, how they stock reservoirs, and lakes with fish just for the sport.
Mm.
It's kind of, and I don't fish. I'm vegetarian. I don't do any of that, but I understand the sport. I mean, it's so relaxing and wonderful. But it's kind of weird when you think that they're stocking it just so humans can catch them.
Yeah.
So,
And sometimes stocking non-native fish at the expense of native fish.
right.
But the other side is that I think a lot of my activities that are, not thought of as traditionally extractive still harm, like even hiking and mountain biking, things I engage in,
Mhm.
degrade trails, but I don't pay for it in the same way that a hunter would. And I wish that I did. I think there's a lot of ways we could make our endeavors also pay into the system. I'd love to see, maybe we're getting way into the weeds here with public policy, but I would love to see a tax on, my mountain biking that somehow creates a fund to do trail repair.
Yeah.
The kind of the hook, the traditionally called the hook and bullet endeavors, they do pay into that. And I don't think we do, not at the same levels.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, up in Park City, Mountain Trails runs the system up here, and Charlie, who runs it, you guys might know him. I don't know.
I know Charlie, yeah. He's a great guy.
Yeah, he's great. So, it's nice to know that there's someone pretty caring and eco-minded behind it. But that's the way with every trail system.
Yeah, but the problem is like that benefits just Park City, and it's a great system.
I know.
But in with the hunting and fishing crowd, their licenses, their bullets, all those things, I think go into funding that is statewide.
Yep.
So, but that also is complicated. So
Very complicated. Yeah.
It'd be wonderful to know what Leopold would have to say about it today.
Yeah, I wonder if he would be like incredibly positive about access, because I even think about our foothills and like near the Capitol, there's a lot of new trails going in for downhill mountain biking, but then also for foot traffic. And I trail run and mountain bike as well, and I'm elated. But from a couple miles out, you start to see these scars in the foothills, and you're like, I wonder what he would think about that. It increases access, but it also decreases the aesthetics of the resource, I guess.
And even though I'm in the world of trail building, it can also fragment habitat.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
Yeah, COVID's brought a whole new interesting thing. I'm sure you guys have seen it down in your communities too. So many more people in the outdoors now this summer and on the trails. The kind of people who maybe walk 1 or 2 miles to a lake. not the usual, suspects like us who go deep in, but, and so it's great. They're getting nature exposure, but all the cars going to those trailheads, major trailhead issues up here. Yeah.
Yeah. Same with where I am.
Yeah, and that's what we strive for our kids to do, as an educator, get in the outdoors, get, experience nature, and they're doing that, but now we're seeing the flip side to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, it makes the idea of education even more important.
Yeah.
Just, I mean, I know land managers are seeing, not to be vulgar, but they're seeing poop in places they hadn't seen poop before.
So I'm thinking that maybe we try and jump back to the main page, because I know this is supposed to go till 11:50 and he had a few other things. So maybe we all leave and head back. Thanks so much for this conversation. This was super insightful. I had a lot of fun.
Yeah, so it's great. You guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Here. All right, can everyone see my screen? I'm going to come down and to the activities that I did at Wasatch Hollow, and the sequence that Leopold has created to make that more effective. So in his essay, The Land Pyramid, which is part of the land ethic, he states, we can be ethical only in relation to something that we can see, feel, love, or otherwise have faith in. And so my view on that is that students will learn to notice. And only after they learn to notice can they begin to understand. And understanding leads to a sense of belonging. And belonging will inspire them to care for the land community. In my breakout group, Susan brought up the citizen science example of citizens in Flint, Michigan. So we might be thinking initially about protecting natural areas, yet our environment includes the things around us, like the water we drink and the air we breathe as well. So there are other angles to this besides natural history. Leopold articulates this need for perception this way. We now come to another component, the perception of the natural process by which the land and living things upon it have achieved their characteristic forms, evolution, and by which they maintain their existence. That thing called nature study, despite the shiver it brings to the spines of the elect, constitutes the first embryonic groping of the mass mind toward perception. This is a greater awareness of the environment we live in. And I will say, yes, the natural areas, but also the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat. And so now I'd like to take you to the activities I composed. In his essay, Wake Up Little Birdie, it's from his account of July on his farm and in the Sand Counties. He describes waking up at 3:30 in the morning and recording each species of bird as it begins to sing. And in the interest of time, I'm going to abbreviate what I'd prepared a little bit. So I do this with my students, and I teach them how to bird. This is a skill I have, is birding by ear. And I teach them how to recognize a few birds and then record every individual bird that they can detect. And the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology has one of the largest citizen science platforms in the world. It's eBird. And so this is my page. As a professional ornithologist, you might guess that I have a vast page, but it's not. I kind of do it intermittently. There are hobbyists who are much more dedicated to eBird than I am. But you can take your observations and submit them. And it's more than field biologists could ever collect. And so let me show you what we're able to observe with this. I chose a couple of different examples. The field sparrow is one that Leopold mentions in that essay. And so this is an animation of the field sparrow's distribution based on citizen science data. Here it is in the wintertime in the Southeast United States. And then in spring, summer, they shift north and west. Thousands and thousands of records collected by citizen scientists. I'll let you watch a couple cycles. Because in that, you also see the pulse of the planet. As the seasons come and go, plants develop and bloom, animals migrate, and then return. And a really dramatic example of that I just found mesmerizing is the snow goose. Again, all based on citizen science observations, people submitting their observation to the Cornell Laboratory. The snow geese are on the move now. They're crossing through Utah. November is one of the best times to see snow geese in our state. Look how they skip around. That's nighttime migrations flying over mountains and deserts and places that they don't use, covering hundreds of miles in a night. From the Arctic, well down into central Mexico, and back. So that's the power of citizen science. And you can identify places where a species might be especially vulnerable and where that was maybe not understood because a crew of biologists hadn't actually been to that site to observe it. Okay, that's the eBird platform. And in another essay from July, there's one called Prairie Birthday, where he describes the first time he discovers a particular species in bloom. And by mid-July, sometimes he's finding 10 or more species in bloom for the first time that season. And so that pairs really well with the citizen science platform, iNaturalist. And I love using this one with students because it's so accessible. The eBird really requires some birding skills. With iNaturalist, all you do is snap a picture of what it is you're observing, and it might be a little flower. I actually studied weeds a lot in my neighborhood last spring. You can get animals. There's a local project out of the Natural History Museum about fox squirrels. They only arrived in our valley about 8 years ago, and I knew that they had been established when I had a pair of them in the box elder tree in my yard. They're that close, there must be a lot of them. So iNaturalist is really accessible, a huge community of people. And you can post your own and an expert will then confirm your identification. So let me show you an example of that. This is an observation I made last June of chokecherry. So I'll pose a question to you. What value do you think an observation like this might have to the scientific community? And feel free to speak up now. What life stage is the chokecherry in?
Flowering.
It's flowering. And what determines when a flower blossoms?
Temperature.
Yeah. So it'll be adapted to its regional climate, but the weather of a given season will determine if it blooms earlier or later in the year. And so these phenology events, and the almanac is very much a chronology of phenological events. It's the life cycle events that happen around a year. That's phenology. Well, if the weather is different one year, then they might be earlier if it's a warmer spring. They might be later if it's a colder spring. And around the country, we're seeing springs that are on average starting earlier and getting warmer faster than the long-term average. And so marking a phenology event is a really important data set to understand the effects of climate change in any region. So then I'll take you now to the National Phenology Network. The network's also an easy one to join and easy to participate in. Nature's Notebook, the National Phenology Network. This is the homepage. Very easy to join. You could do so today if you felt so compelled. And then I'll show you some of their results, similar to what we got from eBird. Because they have so many participants, they get a snapshot of what things are happening nationwide. So the Phenology Network is in the United States, eBird is global. My computer's overheating right now, so I might not be able to open this link for you. Let me try this one. So someone said temperature for when flowers bloomed. Any gardeners out there might be familiar with the growing degree day. So a growing degree day is the amount of heat necessary for a organism to develop. And here are growing degree days for my zip code, 84105. And you've got the average in black, 2019 in yellow, and 2020 in blue. And we can see that in 2020, going up to September, it was a warmer year and we accumulated more growing degree days. And so they can measure this with weather stations, and citizen scientists submit their observations of things like the chokecherry. I follow a couple box elders in my yard, and I also have some cloned lilacs that I have on my campus and at home. The clones are nice because they lack, without the genetic variation, I remove a variable in the experiment. And that timing is, on any given season, determined by the weather of that season. And if you observe for enough years, you can then record the weather patterns and their effect on living things. And that gets to be enough years, you're recording the consequence of climate change. I want to get out of this and take you to a map for that. Let's see, I've got a terrible glare right here, excuse me. I want to share with you a map of how the weather changed. All right. So on this map, can you see my screen now?
Looks like you exited out of screen sharing.
Okay, thank you for telling me. All right, now you should be able to. So this is citizen science data from National Phenology Network, and people were recorded events like the blooming of things in their yards and parks and in their neighborhoods. In the southeast, we see these dark red colors indicating that spring arrived 20 days earlier. This is for 2020, just this year. And if you remember this last spring, there was an Arctic blast that came down into the Midwest, and that actually delayed things. And so for 2020, we had a later date. And then you see that in the West, it's not as homogeneous of a pattern. However, we do see that in the higher elevations, the pattern over recent years has been earlier springtime than over the long-term average. Okay, I want to share with you some other things. It's 11:52. David, do you want me to wrap it up right now, or can I go to show globe?
No, I think that you probably get to do another 5 minutes or so. Okay.
All right. The next citizen science platform I want to share with you is, I paired with Leopold's essay, The Good Oak. And in The Good Oak, he describes an ancient oak tree on his farm that gets struck by lightning. And so they let it dry out for a year, and then they cut it down. And as he goes through the tree rings, he recounts the history of the prairie in south central Wisconsin, going back to the 20s and 30s, and then the early pioneers and the times when Native Americans would have been their passenger pigeons. Well, it turns out there's some really great citizen science opportunities to study trees. And so one is, the one I want to share with you is from Globe. And Globe is an enormous citizen science platform. It's a little less accessible to the hobbyist, like iNaturalist and eBird are very accessible to the hobbyist. Globe requires somewhat more elaborate protocols for most of its work, but they do have an app-based platform. So it's called the Globe Observer. And on this, they have a series of protocols that you can do from your phone. And so I wanted to share with you the tree protocol, taking observations from trees. So in this one, in the interest of time, I'm just going to explain. I had some videos lined up. But you use your phone as a camera, you use it as a clinometer, and you measure a tree. You measure its circumference at chest height, so 4.5 feet high, you measure its circumference. And then you step back and you measure your distance from the tree, and then the angle to the top of the tree, and the angle to the base. And through some surprisingly simple math, you can calculate the mass of the tree. And from the mass, it's an easy step to the biomass, that's its dry weight. And from that, it's an easy step to the amount of carbon contained in the tree. And from that, a little arithmetic, and you can calculate the amount of carbon dioxide sequestered by that tree. And so when you submit this tree measurement to Globe, they use your measurement from the ground as a way to calibrate their satellites that are going over the planet. There are 3 or 4 satellites that go over, and they're taking measurements of forests, tree height, canopy structure. And then when they get over treeless areas like Arctic ice, they're also measuring the height of the ice. And they need ground measurements as a way to calibrate their satellite measurements. So the Globe Tree is one of the most user-friendly programs they have. There's another one for which there's not as direct a Leopold connection, but it's a really user-friendly program, and that's the clouds. So Globe Clouds, you go out, I have a reminder telling me when a satellite's going to pass overhead, and I go out and take 5 minutes and make a cloud observation. And again, they use that to calibrate satellite measurements of clouds. And all of which give us, from NASA and the people who are processing this data, they give us an image of Earth processes that you could never get from just ground observations. But the ground observations are necessary to calibrate the remote sensing from satellites. And it enables us to do things like more accurately predict when hurricanes or fires are going to happen, or how they're advancing when they are happening. So it opens up to a vast world of science. I want to share with you my contact. So maybe if this is the last thing I get to share with you today, it's an invitation to join Globe. And so I've created an account. It's, if you download the Globe Observer onto your phone, you can create your own, or you can join a team. So my team is Robert Wilson. And then to get in that team, it's this password here, reference number. And I will paste this into chat. For you to write down. There it is. I put it in there twice. All right, well, it takes us to 11:57. And I hope I've inspired some interest in Leopold, if you've heard of him before, or maybe you're new to Leopold. And I hope that I've inspired some interest in pursuing citizen science on your own. And if you're a teacher, in sharing citizen science with your students. In the age of COVID, citizen science has become a really important source of data because research projects were inhibited by quarantine and various consequences of the epidemic. citizen science has really emerged as a valuable resource for scientists studying Earth systems. Takes us to about 12 o'clock. I'd be happy to hear any questions or comments at this point.
And Rob, would you mind dropping your contact info if you feel comfortable doing so? If people have questions about some of your ideas, would you mind dropping that in the chat?
I'd be happy to.
What I have something, what I'm so interested in is all of the areas that you teach about in relation to the temperature model that you showed. Obviously, you know, you talk about plants and how the rising temperatures relate to plants, but what are all the other areas that you cover in your classes? So we don't have time to talk about it now, but you know, maybe you can refer us to all the areas you cover that's being affected by temperature change.
Yeah, that's a fairly lengthy question.
Yes.
Or answer. The answer to that question could be quite lengthy.
Yes. So maybe you could give us a resource for that, and we can do our own research.
Yeah, I've assembled those materials. So David, I could work out a way to share it with people today who are here with us today.
Yeah, so you can, if you have like a series of links and things like that, if that's in the form it's in, you can submit those. Let's see, I think you could probably email those directly to Alex, which would be the director@uc.org email address.
Yeah.
And I'll put that in.
Mary, I'd be glad to do that. I actually have a wide array of temperature-oriented experiments, some dealing with plants. I do a lab where I grow silkworms from eggs. This is really, really fun to do. So I get silkworms and I grow them in incubators. They only eat mulberries. So we go out into our neighborhood and collect mulberry leaves. And the eggs start out the size of a poppy seed.
Sorry, Rob. I'm not trying to interrupt, but Alex is starting the lunch session, and she has this login info. So I think it was in like 10 seconds. We were about to just get completely cut off. So
okay, I understand.
If you want to move this convo over to that would be super appropriate. But thank you so much, Rob. This was so insightful, so informative, and I look forward to the rest of the afternoon. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
Thank you.
Sorry about that, Rob. Alex was like, I'm about to start this one over here.
That's fine. I know how you got to keep a schedule. It's fine.
Okay, but thank you again. And yeah, I'll see you all very soon.
Okay.